Monsieur le Président d'Irlande.
Mr. President, Mrs. Higgins, it is an immense honor for me to welcome you in the chamber of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which brings together members of parliament from all over Europe to support human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Mr. President, during your long and rich career as a politician, poet, sociologist, author, and broadcaster, you have shown enormous commitment to these values. Therefore, your visit to Strasbourg is highly symbolic. As we are facing numerous challenges in terms of respect of human rights in Europe and worldwide, we have to draw strength from the values that underpin the foundations of the Council of Europe. In your address to the European Parliament 2 years ago, you rightly stressed that the founding fathers of today's Europe, and I quote, sought not only to replace war with peace, but more importantly, to construct a vision of Europe's people working together in an inclusive way. Our Assembly is an attempt to make this vision a reality with democratically elected politicians representing 820 million Europeans working together to protect and promote our common historic, intellectual, and cultural heritage. To succeed, we need the support of all member states and political forces across the continent. In this context, Ireland's commitment to our values is exemplary, be it in the provision of support to human rights defenders, the promotion of social justice and solidarity, or the development of North-South dialogue and assistance to our neighbours who strive to build democratic societies. But what is even more important is the commitment of individuals and leaders who speak out with courage, passion, and determination for human rights and democratic principles. It is no doubt for this reason that you were elected president with more votes than any other Irish politician in the past. You are not afraid of controversy. You warned that Ireland was sleepwalking into disaster with its high youth unemployment rates. I wonder what warning you might have for us today. You are not a stranger to this Assembly, having been yourself a member from 2001 to 2003. Therefore, we are very much looking forward to hearing your address, which, I have no doubt, will be a major source of inspiration for us as individuals and for our work. Mr. President, Mrs. Higgins, a Uchteron, get Millefort Roth, which means, and I translate, which means, Mr. President, 100,000 welcomes.
Madame la Présidente, occulted and Tignol Parliamentary, members of the Parliamentary Assembly, is mean lam a weakest a gwole vasach na deshu hartam laurtlish and Tignol sha. Tignol a hagen lekelia taskri Parliamentary, the data sa shock stout Yorpig, Will the Colin Hjorpa Institute will roll Santasak imere aki on den lahasa san real and lee a lodru fud or nil kriok. I am continuing in English.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, President. You know, my mother tongue is Luxembourgish and nobody will understand it. We don't understand your language, but thank you very much for addressing us at the opening in your language. And I tried to do my best to welcome you in your language, but I had to translate it because I didn't understand it myself. You have the floor, President.
Well, it is one of the great achievements of the Council of Europe to support minorities and their languages. May I begin then, Madame la Présidente, by thanking you for your visit to Dublin in June of last year, and for the kind invitation you extended to me then to address this Assembly. And may I also congratulate you on your re-election to the position of President, and wish you and all the other members of the Parliamentary Assembly enduring stamina, imagination, and moral courage, too, in continuing to build up European cooperation and the rule of law in response to the great challenges of our times. It is for me both an honor and a great pleasure to be in this chamber, in this distinguished institution, the Council of Europe, which conjures up the very first steps of Europe's moral and cultural reconstruction after the devastation of World War II. I am animated too by a particular sense of urgency and gravity, as all of us, elected representatives of the peoples of Europe, are seeking to make our way through what must be described as a fragile moment for democracy. Ours are times when, again, we acutely need and appreciate the opportunities offered by the Council of Europe as a unique pan-European cooperation body. And these are times, too, that require us to rekindle the values of human dignity and democratic pluralism that the Council upholds and fosters. As one of the 10 founding members, Ireland has been and remains keenly aware of the important role the Council of Europe has played in shaping our own path in European cooperation. The young Irish state had remained neutral through the Second World War. It was, in the late 1940s, a somewhat poor country, geographically peripheral, and whose foreign policy was very much coloured by unresolved issues with its powerful neighbour and former coloniser, the United Kingdom. Thus, Irish participation in the Hague Congress and in the negotiations in London that culminated in the Council of Europe Statute in 1949 represented an important early engagement with the ideas and debates then coalescing about the shape and scope of post-war cooperation. Over subsequent years, our membership in the Council and our implementation of the European Convention on Human Rights have been fundamental in consolidating the rule of law and in supporting positive social change in Ireland. Today, in the face of the new challenges that overhang Europe, I deem it important to start by reaffirming my country's solid commitment to multilateralism and to the goals and principles that have guided the Council of Europe's endeavours throughout the 65 years of its existence. Indeed, ever since its foundation, and with a renewed sense of purpose during the decade which made history after the end of the Cold War, the Council of Europe has provided an essential catalyst for firstly highlighting the fundamental principles of pluralist democracy, respect for human rights and the rule of law. Secondly, working on the setting of standards in the human rights area through the European Convention on Human Rights system and other legal mechanisms. And thirdly, confirming the common goal of a freer, more tolerant and just society in Europe. This is an overall framework for which we must consciously and proactively care, and which we must nurture as an indispensable component of the architecture of stability, peace, and trust we have been building on this continent over the decades. It is a legacy of profound ethical significance, one that is admired and emulated across the globe, and which we must be mindful not to let unravel. Rather, we must extend and strengthen it. Before I come to those destructive currents, which in my view threaten unraveling our European systems of cohesion and cooperation, may I acknowledge more specifically the Council of Europe's immense contribution to the vindication of human rights in the fullness and indivisibility of their breadth. Of course, the European Convention on Human Rights and its protocol, which my country signed in 1950, ratified in 1953, and the activities of the European Court of Human Rights lie at the center of this Council's work. I am delighted at the prospect, of course, of visiting the court this afternoon, an institution which is so fundamental not only to the Council of Europe, but to European democracy in the broadest sense. Ireland's deep regard for the activities of the court and for its role in strengthening democratic debate is reflected, for example, in our support for the court's webcasting programme. Since 2006, Ireland has voluntarily funded the webcasting of Grand Chamber hearings before the court, by allowing free access to some of the most important proceedings taking place here in Strasbourg. This project not only enables citizens to better understand the court's operations and the rights that flow from the convention itself, it also makes citizens aware of the manner in which the vindication of human rights can inform and invigorate democratic life and societal change in their own country. In the area of socio-economic rights, the adoption of the European Social Charter was a milestone in suggesting that human flourishing entails the effective enjoyment of social rights as well as civil and political ones. I am glad to say that Ireland has been a supporter of both the original and the revised Charter, and that it has accepted the collective complaints mechanism presided over by the European Committee of Social Rights. The Irish have also backed the more recent initiatives aimed at strengthening the system of protection under the European Social Charter, including the Turin process. A further strength of the Council of Europe has been its emphasis on the role of culture in nurturing democracy. For the Irish, a nation attached to the preservation of its ancient Gaelic language, the adoption of the Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, as I have said, is but one example, and it was an important step towards the recognition of cultural rights throughout Europe. Taken together, then, the human rights structures of the Council present a model of both efficacy and sophistication in the promotion and protection of rights and liberties, and they also demonstrate a firm commitment to the fundamental principle of the indivisibility of human rights, apprehended at once in their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural dimensions. Our foundations, then, are more than adequate. But this is not to say that Ireland is blind to the possibilities that exist for enhancing the efficacy of the Court of Human Rights and indeed the Council at large. Ireland is supportive of the reform process undertaken by the Court, and we, of course, welcome the achievements it has already secured in reducing the enormous backlog which at one stage threatened its very functioning. More broadly, Ireland endorsed the decision of the 2005 Warsaw Summit to refocus on the Council of Europe's primary mission to promote human rights, the rule of law, and democracy in Europe. And it has been a long-standing supporter of Secretary General Jagland's efforts in that regard. Yet, while recognizing the need for qualified, informed and positive reform, I wish to express my disquiet and concern at those endeavours underway in some quarters that risk undermining the very legitimacy of both the Court and the Convention on Human Rights itself. Some of these criticisms addressed to the Court pertain, of course, to a wider political argument about Europe. And given Ireland's particular historical, economic, political, institutional, and territorial circumstances, the terms of this debate about Europe constitute for us Irish a very serious matter for concern. Let me state things very clearly then. The European Convention on Human Rights must remain the cornerstone of human rights protection in Europe. And to those who might suggest that there is a tension between the principles of parliamentary democracy and the international protection of human rights, let us respond unequivocally that parliaments flourish in an atmosphere where rights are vindicated. These two propositions must, I believe, provide the basis for our collective discussions as the Council of Europe and Europe itself are arriving at a crucial juncture in their history. European cooperation currently faces a range of serious difficulties that must be and are of concern to all European citizens, and in a particular way to their elected representatives, including yourselves. Indeed, it is in your capacity as delegates of the national parliaments of Europe that I address you today, and it is by appealing to your experience and your sense of responsibility as parliamentarians that I now turn to the alarming trends, some of a new kind, others the recrudescence of old ills that currently imperil democracy, social cohesion, and our shared future, both within our national communities and at European level. As a former parliamentarian myself, honoured to have spent over 3 decades serving in the Irish National Parliament, including some years, as you have said, President, as a member of this Assembly from 2001 to 2003. I have the greatest respect for the work parliamentarians perform to fulfill and respond to the needs and aspirations of the citizens who elect them, and for their practice of debating, differing, and reaching accommodation on the important issues that shape our public world. The suggestion I wish to put before you today is that however grave the challenges we face, they also present parliamentarians with an opportunity to reassert the relevance of parliaments, their discourse, their representations, and indeed their capacity to revitalize the project of European cooperation. The first challenge we're facing, as the members of this Assembly are acutely aware, is the disquieting return to our continent of grave geopolitical fractures, carrying disastrous human consequences. As we meet here this morning, armed conflict is continuing on the territory of a member state of the Council, Ukraine, with catastrophic repercussions for its citizens, as the report of Mr. Sheridan, debated here just before I rose, powerfully recounts. Putting an end to military violence so as to enable people from all sides to return to their homes and communities and rebuild their lives is at once a pressing and, of course, an arduous task. It is a task that calls for the resources and the skills and the patience of various parties. Yet it is clear, too, that longer term and deeply rooted differences have to be tackled in a spirit of dialogue and cooperation, founded on justice and a respect for fundamental rights. That is the test and that is the challenge for diplomacy. And it is here that the Council of Europe has a clear and indeed imperative contribution to make, beyond the important initiatives that have already been undertaken by members of this Assembly, and of course also by yourself, Madam President, who have been so exemplary in your endeavours to maintain contact with all delegations, and to uphold that delicate but essential balance between principles on the one hand, and on the other, openness and readiness to discuss the necessity of ending the havoc of the present destruction. A second profound challenge to democracy and social cohesion arises from new forms of fanaticism and conflict, whose ramifications reach out to the heart of our European cities. These threats were brought home to us, of course, most recently in Paris, where within the space of 3 days we saw freedom of expression and freedom of the press assaulted in the most direct and dreadful of ways, through the murder of a satirical paper's entire editorial team, and a further 4 men coldly assassinated in an act of pure anti-Semitism. The task of responding to the root causes of such threats is of immense complexity. This is not just because these new forms of violence arise at the obscure intersection of global geopolitical tensions, individual trajectories and beliefs, and complex structures of social inequalities, but also because there are great risks inherent in both the very responses that might emerge from fear and anger among our citizens, and then too in the obvious potential for political exploitation of these passions. I know that the ambassadors of the Council of Europe's 47 member states have agreed last week under the Belgian chairmanship on a decision to step up action against terrorism. The challenge, of course, is not confined to reactive responses. It entails understanding and addressing the motivations of those young people who are drawn to extremism and political violence. The challenge also extends, I believe, to those novel uses of technology and science, such as cyber attacks and remote extrajudicial executions performed by machines that blur the boundaries between war and peace and risk instilling generalized suspicion between and within our societies. I sincerely believe that the Council of Europe and this Assembly in particular must continue to play an important role in upholding the rule of law in the face of destructive forms of extremism, be they of a religious or nationalistic type, as well, of course, as state hubris. The Council of Europe has shown in the past that it had the ability not to lose sight of fundamental human rights. For instance, when the general atmosphere in the West had overtones of a new crusade. One example was the 2006 report by Senator Dick Marty, documenting the participation, both active and passive, of some of the Council's member states in CIA detentions and transfers, what was called renditions. Senator Marty's report was of great international significance in recasting debates on the balance between counterterrorism and the protection of human rights. I recall myself referring to this report during debates in Dáil in our lower chamber. This was just one instance among many others when I could clearly see the great benefits that derived from close interaction between discussions and parliamentary work taking place in national parliaments and those in European and even global fora. More broadly, I believe that parliaments offer an important and privileged channel to increase public participation in and awareness of urgent foreign policy debates. The conception of professional diplomatic activity and raison d'etat as being in conflict with emotional and moralist public opinion is, in my view, a very flawed one. Parliaments can and must hold governments accountable for what is said and done, or not said and done, in the wider world in the name of their citizens. This debate on whether foreign policy is an essentially executive function or whether it can genuinely accommodate democratic accountability is, of course, by no means a new one. It is interesting to note, for example, that among the issues reported back during the first years of Ireland's membership of the Council of Europe was that of the relative strengths and prerogatives in this organisation of the Assembly and of the Council of Ministers. In 1949, the Irish delegate Sean MacBride remarked to his own parliament, the Dáil, "To a large extent, the statute which is presented to the House is designed to shackle the members of the Assembly. But I feel that with the passage of time, the members of the Assembly themselves will take things into their own hands." Foreign policy, then, is not the only domain where parliaments should, I suggest, reassert their relevance. Economic and fiscal policy is, I suggest, another essential area and an urgent one for proactive parliamentary activity and discourse. And indeed, a third, perhaps less directly confrontational but no less undermining, threat for the future of European democracy is revealed, I believe, in the largely unquestioned leeching of power and authority from parliaments to the apostles of a narrow version of fiscal orthodoxy, an orthodoxy that seems predicated on a depeopled version of the economy. Today, global financial markets, assumed to be self-regulating and unaccountable bodies such as rating agencies, occupy a far greater space in contemporary media and discourse than do parliaments debating the fears and welfare of citizens. What has happened, we must ask ourselves, to the field of public economics and its discourse, for its decision-making structures, previously located in representative institutions, where differences based on declared assumptions were respected, to have given so much ground to a single version of expert knowledge about the so-called laws governing the economy? How have we let rating agencies, as I have said, for example, act as some kind of modern panopticon, not bound by any democratic requirement, gain such influence on the life world and prospects of our citizens? And what can be done? Parliaments, both at national and European level, must urgently claim back competence and legitimacy on economic and fiscal matters. In saying this, I am not negating the limitations which severe fiscal constraints, combined with intense global competition, impose onto our elected representatives' ability to craft a variety of policy options. What I am saying is that no single economic paradigm can ever be adequate to address the complexity of our world's varying contexts and contingencies. The current status quo, whereby decisions which are the legitimate object of political debate and normative arguments have been abandoned to the automaticity of rigid fiscal rules from one corner of a dominating paradigm, even as economists themselves disagree over the theoretical soundness of such rules. This status quo is a highly perilous one for the future of our politics and our citizens. We do need good economics based on pluralist models and connected and answerable to society. And in that, parliaments matter. Centuries of effort have been invested by European citizens in securing the vote. It is to their elected representatives that citizens look for accountability, for the opening up of new collective possibilities lodged in sound policy options, and for connecting them to wider horizons through their work in international fora such as this Assembly. Can we let go these hard-won advances? And have we considered the consequences of leaching this legitimacy, this authority, this capacity? It is my profound conviction that a strong case can be made for the centrality of ethics to our deliberations on economic matters. This requires no dismissal of any tool of economics, not to speak of the field in itself. It is simply asking for a context for economics that is ethical. Indeed, questions of political economy can never appropriately be regarded as purely technical ones. They have, I suggest, an intrinsic normative dimension and should therefore always be open to political discussion and dissension. My message is not a pessimistic one. National parliaments and supranational parliamentary bodies such as this one, I suggest, can reclaim a central role in preserving the public world that lies at the heart of European democracy. That essential space shared by citizens who must be free to debate in an open and pluralist manner, whose children must have access to a pluralist scholarship, be enabled to imagine alternatives to the ideas and practices that govern their present circumstances, and project their future together in their national communities, and in Europe or at global level. And the Council of Europe has shown an impressive lead in addressing the fiscal questions of our time from an ethical perspective, as is demonstrated by the recent initiative of the Commissioner for Human Rights on the theme of safeguarding human rights in times of economic crisis. If we are to respond to this crisis of democracy in a holistic manner, recognizing the political, economic, social, and cultural dimensions to the problems before us, Parliamentarians, you have so obviously have a most valuable perspective to offer. Every day on the streets, in your advice centres, you encounter unemployment, poverty, and the feelings of alienation and insecurity expressed by those, and particularly the young, who, as Jürgen Habermas put it, have to pick up the tab for the impacts on the real economy of a predictable dysfunction of the financial system, and who, as he puts it, unlike the shareholders, do not pay in money values, but in the hard currency of their daily existence. I reflect and think of what Theodor Adorno once said: "The need to let suffering speak is the condition of all truth." This, I believe, is also profoundly valid for political truth. And the suffering all of us elected representatives should endeavour to voice is not just that in our own parishes. We are invited to seize upon contemporary issues of global significance, such as climate change and the new Sustainable Development Goals currently being negotiated in the United Nations. The choices that will be made at the end of this year, 2015, in relation to both agendas, in New York in September for the post-2015 development agenda, in Paris in December for the climate change negotiations. These decisions will have a real impact, not just on the peoples of the South, but for all of us on the globe, including in the Western world. We are called upon, I suggest, to revise simplistic binary definitions of development, not just because elements of the South are now in the North, and vice versa, some features of the North have migrated to the South, but also because global environmental and social issues, such as, for example, the scale of the refugee crisis in Europe's own neighbourhood, demand a complete shift in mindset and discourse. These great global challenges require all of us to take part, not to abandon any old and divisive North-South conversation or confrontation, but to indulge in a conversation about our humanity itself and its future. And they present our parliaments, should they seize the opportunity to assert their legitimacy and design clever institutional strategies, with a unique chance to reassert their relevance of Parliament and contribute to the fundamental task of crafting appropriate and morally grounded responses to our contemporary circumstances. We, elected representatives, are challenged to respond to the current historical moment through our best practice in our national and European assemblies, but also as ethical subjects, conscious of our shared vulnerabilities, our solidarity, and our interdependence with all those who dwell with us on this fragile planet. So let us not be daunted then by the magnitude of the task. Let us rather bring to it as much work and competence to this project as we can. Let us build such bridges as will secure the trust and confidence of all of our people by showing ourselves to be authoritative and responsive on all matters, including fiscal and economic matters. Let those who have the experience of Parliament show that they can negotiate the pathways from national arenas to the complex supranational structures of decision-making and power we are now faced with. You have the mandate to do so on behalf of your electorates, and I wish you well in seizing back the discourse about the defining economic and social choices of our time. This is an essential imperative if we truly wish to preserve the democratic system created for Europe after World War II, and which held firm as the division of the continent ended 25 years ago. In a way, we are invited to engage in no less than a cultural and ethical refounding of the kind that was completed by the architects of European cooperation at the midpoint of the 20th century. Today again, from the flux of our diverse European histories, from our current problems, from our fears and our aspirations, there can emerge a response that will accommodate what our collective memory has made endure. and that which the human spirit has invested with hope. Today again, we are invited to reach back to a fertile tradition of rich scholarship, moral instincts, and general impulses that were there in European thought. But we're asked, too, to take from the work of utopian and ethical visionaries. But we're also urged to be creative as we construct a realistic strategy for sustaining a culture of peace, democracy, and human rights in Europe. And we're required to be bold as we work together, in cooperation, open to the world, caring for it in an intergenerationally responsible way. And all of this is possible. Mar focal square to finish. The European Court of Human Rights has in one publication been described as the conscience of Europe, extending with poetic license that label of honor to the Council of Europe as a whole. We might regard all of you here in your various tasks and activities as citizens of the Republic of Conscience, described by Irish Nobel Prize winner Seamus Heaney in his famous poem he wrote to celebrate International Human Rights Day. That poem ends with the following lines. The old man rose and gazed into my face and said, that was official recognition, that I was now a dual citizen. He therefore desired me, when I got home, to consider myself a representative and to speak on their behalf in my own tongue. Their embassies, he said, were everywhere, but operated independently, and no ambassador would ever be relieved. God of Mila Mahaki, thank you.
Thank you very much, President, for your most inspiring address to us and for having stressed the role of parliamentarians and also the role of our responsibility. And we shall recall that we need a centrality of ethics, as you rightly underlined, and also that we are, and I take that as a lesson, that we are citizens of the Republic of Conscience. Thank you very much. And now we have a number of speakers who would like to put some questions to you. The first speaker is Mr. Iwinski from Poland on behalf of the Socialist Group. Mr. Iwinski, you have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. President, Ireland traditionally has been a country of emigration, first of all to America. However, recently, it also became an important country of destination, mainly for the people from new EU member states, particularly from Poland. How do you see the role of your giant diaspora on one hand, and on another, the integration challenges as well as dilemmas inevitably created by newcomers?
President?
When I, as a young sociologist in the United States, the first great work on migration that I read was Thomas and Zaniecki's work on the role of the Polish peasant in Europe and America. It was one of the great seminal works on migration, based on the letters of Polish immigrants. I think we were very pleased in Ireland when, among a group of 10 countries, Poland joined the European Union. We had the great benefit, too, of many Polish people coming to live with us, they contributed to our community and our society and our economy. And I was very pleased that after the economic contraction, that they stayed with us. I had an opportunity of meeting some of them, I think, when I visited Poznan for the Ireland game against Croatia. And we had an opportunity also of meeting Polish communities, some of whom were of such great warmth and benefit to some of our Irish people who had got into difficulties. Your question is an interesting one, of course, because what we have found in Ireland in relation to the Polish community is that whether they are learning Polish, as they have opportunities in some of our schools, whether they are celebrating their own belief system with their own chapel and whatever, they've been able to place the richness of a rich culture alongside our own. And that is as it should be. The movement of people between our common shared European home is of fundamental importance. As to the other issues where we have found in responding, as I said, to what politely can be called the economic contraction, our own diaspora has of been great importance to us in a practical sense in helping to create the infrastructure for the resolution of difficulties in Northern Ireland. It was of immense value, but also in relation to telling the world what the advantages are of coming to establish business and research and development in what is the country that has the largest cohort of young people between 18 and 25 who have finished third-level education and are highly qualified. Our diasporas are important. Boundaries should never exist in relation to the human spirit. And that is what we must do now. Concentrate on our common shared instincts to deepen our humanity, but express it in all of the different forms of interaction that we have with each other. I repeat that this is not utopian. This is highly practical and highly achievable.
Thank you. Now, next speaker, Mr. O'Reilly from Ireland, on behalf of the EPP Group.
Thank you, Madam President. President Higgins, we are greatly honoured that you are able to join us here today. I would like to join with President Brazier in sincerely welcoming you to Strasbourg. And on behalf of the EPP Group, I want to thank you for an insightful and thought-provoking address. We were all horrified by the terrorist killings in Paris earlier this month, which represented a direct attack on the fundamental core of the Council of Europe's mission. Equally, we are heartened by the unprecedented solidarity which followed. We know that there is a transnational and multi-sector response needed alongside security. But what I would like to ask you, Mr. President, is how would you propose a holistic response to this current threat, and what broad strategies would you suggest we employ? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And indeed, it's a pleasure to hear Ireland being so well represented in the Council of Europe. I think that it is very important that we cooperate and that we share our informations in relation to dealing with the short term, both in terms of reaction and in terms of prevention. I think, too, it is increasingly important that we look at what we have neglected. We have neglected the conversations that should have taken place between those who genuinely, for example, advance faith systems based on fundamental texts. And in our failure often to support the moderate advancement and the respect for the differences between faith systems and ethnic identities, we have created a kind of lacuna into which distortions of text and those who would seek, like predators, to exploit fear have moved. So yes, we must cooperate together and be unequivocal in relation to our defence of the values that are at the heart of the Council of Europe, including, of course, obviously, freedom of speech, and then all the responsibilities that go with it too. But also, I think we must look at the task of both, in fact, being able to support those who genuinely have belief systems, who have different beliefs, not just religious and spiritual ones, but other political ones, to create a discourse of tolerance. That is work that, because it is urgent now, has to be proceeded with, I think, through the medium and the long term. We might ask how in many of our countries, what strategies are there within the education system to be able to look at the stranger as someone with whom we share vulnerabilities on our fragile planet. And how many other tendencies are there now that must be confronted, that suggesting that the stranger or the person who is different must be looked at with aggression and so forth. We cannot be unequivocal about any of these tendencies in our Europe if we are to uphold the values that are there at the core of the Council of Europe.
Next speaker, Mr. Leiden from Ireland on behalf of the ALDE Group.
Madam President, on behalf of the President, Mr. Jordi Costa, and members of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe, and indeed all the Irish delegation, I extend to you, President of Ireland, Uachtarán Éireann, Michael Higgins, and First Lady Sabina Higgins, a céad míle fáilte on behalf of all of us here in this Council of Europe Assembly. Having served as a distinguished member of the Council of Europe from 2001 to 2003, you are familiar with the work of this Assembly and the Court of Human Rights, and your speech certainly outlined the situation extremely well, and well done on that wonderful, inspirational speech. As one of the founding members, Ireland in 1949 can be very proud, a small country that worked with the other 9 to form the Council of Europe. You as President of our country, and all of us are very proud of that. Just finally want to say, President Higgins, as a distinguished lecturer in sociology and political science in the National University of Ireland in Galway, I had the benefit of your inspiring lectures as an extramural student in the early 1970s. So thank you for your contribution to my political career as one of the most inspirational lecturers that ever studied or gave lectures in sociology or politics in Galway. And finally, your record on human rights is well documented. And finally, I feel one issue which you and I worked together in the Irish Parliament was the situation regarding the future of Palestine and the establishment of an independent Palestine in harmony with Israel. Something very close to your heart and your political work.
Thank you. I want to recall that you have 30 seconds to ask questions.
See, I didn't cover that in my lectures, President. I'm very grateful for the good wishes, and beginning at the end, I don't think that any of us could overestimate the importance it would be if we had significant progress in relation to the issues of Palestine and Israel. Indeed, this is a very significant day when the Secretary-General is represented in Auschwitz for us to realise that we must move forward into a new space and have discussions that are supported, I suggest, by a secretariat, rather like we had in Ireland, in the Northern Ireland, so that you can have continuity between one set of suggestions and another. I suggest too to you that 2015 is an incredibly important year. The meeting in Addis Ababa on how, for example, the funding which should take place in relation to the Millennium Sustainable Development Goals is very important. The one I mentioned in September is important. So this issue, why I mentioned what I mean by saying issues of the South or in the North, I meant, of course, the large exclusions that are there as a result of unemployment and poverty and so on. And then what I mentioned about the North that had gone to the South was how we must look at how on continents like Africa and South America, we must have a development that includes the people and that rather than flowing to the benefits to an elite. These are real issues. But what I mentioned, I'm absolutely very clear about. After Doha, and with once again the tones of the Delhi Declaration very much available to them, we don't need a wasteful North-South confrontation. We must operate with a new sheet in which we will make proposals that will have global acceptability. That means rethinking our new models. We cannot have a situation, for example, where in previous proposals more was spent on paying the interest on debt from some of the poorest countries than was permitted to be spent on health and education. These days should be behind us. We are now in a new place in relation to both in terms of climate change, vulnerability, our responsibility to the planet and future generations, in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, in making sure that we eliminate preventable diseases, all of these things. But as well, the last word I would say, as you will well know and often debate, our present world is scarred by inequality. Now, right across the social sciences, there is nobody who is suggesting that inequality is of benefit, that it is necessary for growth. And all serious writing in the social sciences is suggesting that one of the greatest impediments to both stability at global level, stability in Europe and nationally, are widening and growing gaps of inequality and all that flows from them.
Thank you. And then the last speaker on behalf of the political groups is Mr. Cox, the President of the United Left from the Netherlands.
Mr. President, be aware that there are also Irish members in the group of the United Left, but my group allowed me to ask you a question. The question is this. After the storms of austerity, now winds of change seem to reach Europe. Yesterday, in Greece, Prime Minister Tsipras was sworn in against all warnings of mainstream politicians, but he was seen as a signal of hope by so many Greek people. These winds of change soon might reach your country as well, if we look to all kinds of surveys. What, Mr. President, what made that so many mainstream politicians were, perhaps still are, why they casted such a blind eye on the social effects of austerity and on the political consequences that people might lose their trust in democratic institutions? I'm looking for an inspiring answer from your side. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that if one looks back at world history, it was important when the capacity to print books became available. There were those who opposed the extension of the capacity to print and read. They said that people would read not just the Bible, and they might even read Tom Paine, and that was very dangerous. I believe that it is increasingly important that all of our citizens have the opportunity of hearing and understanding economics and how choices are being taken. I think, in a way, I cannot comment on recent events in any country, but I do say this, that it is interesting that all of my speeches since I became president have been about the integrated nature of ethics, economy, ecology, and society. These are not abstractions, but equally, I think, is that the public having been invited onto the street, it is the responsibility of those who speak on their behalf to empower them with the capacity to be able to read their world and read their institutions to fully participate. If one didn't do that, one would have to some extent been reacting to the capacity was there of a great disquiet. But I also have stressed, and it is very important, it's an issue that's, as somebody myself who was a university teacher, I stressed, remember it's there in all of the speeches, we need pluralist education, and we need a pluralist teaching of economic theory. In some of the most called developed economies of the world, I think some of the greatest universities spend less than 15% of an entire student's life on the history of the subject economics. What one has seen in a way is that an instrument becomes an excuse for a method that in turn then becomes a substitute for theory. But sometimes it is said, you see, this is my point, it's very foolish to reject all economics. It's very foolish to say that one shouldn't use all of these sophisticated tools that are available to us. But it is absolutely essential that it is embedded in an ethical context. I could go much farther than what your question suggests by saying simply like this. It is possible, for example, for us to envisage a common European home, a very common global home, in which we agree to transfer sovereignty to make certain values achievable in the future, but that we not do so, that we're not forfeiting 1 second all of our capacity, our rights, our duties, and our responsibilities to implement what is there in the charter that has come from the Council of Europe. And there is the opening for discussion and for debate. Let's take all the possibilities of the Charter and regard those as our common responsibilities. And then we go on and we exchange and pool our sovereignty to achieve security and stability on the bigger issues, such as the ones I mentioned, sustainable development and climate. All of that is possible.
Thank you. I apologize. Thank you. I apologize. I forgot to ask Mr. Salvi from Turkey to take the floor on behalf of the European Conservative Group. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. In 2009, Europe entered the deepest recession since the end of the Second World War, and Ireland was among the countries which were shaken with the crisis. Now, economic assessments of international institutions indicate that Ireland is on the way of returning to pre-recession level. The recovery pace of Irish economy and its exit from the bailout program in a period of 2 years are impressive. Please allow me to express my congratulations and ask your comments on regarding this speech.
Well, I'm glad to say that the unemployment rate in Ireland has decreased, is from over 15% to just 10%, and is sinking, that new jobs are being created. I think that the export performance has been very good. I think on the real economy, the agricultural economy, it was very positive even during the period of contraction. But this adjustment has taken place with a huge sacrifice by the people of Ireland. And in taking your question very directly, I used a phrase in my speech called the de-peopled economy. Economies, it's a descriptive word if you use it like that, but it is the people who compose the society and the people to whom the economy serves. And that was the view of some very conservative and very indeed progressive economists, from Lord Keynes back through Adam Smith in his theory of moral sentiments. So therefore we need to think of what we say about the economy as embedded, as I've said, in ethics and in the social context. In relation to what you are suggesting, which is interesting, the economy is not, in the Irish case, is not a driverless car. It has citizens aboard, and those citizens paid a very high price. And I don't think it is helpful to be using Ireland as some kind of exemplar as how others should practice. I think the Irish government was in a very difficult position. It took very difficult decisions. We are all glad that the economy, in so many ways, for example, the debt to GDP ratio will be 2.7 next year. The export performance is very good. The unemployment figures, but there's still so much to do. The Irish government and any other party equally recognises that it's still too high. Immigration is too high. The lack of opportunities in investment are there. I would just say this as well, that it isn't only a matter, for example, of fixing the flows between banks in terms of their assets. It is a matter of getting an investment structure. This is a European problem as to how you will ensure real investment in a real economy that will create employment and that will create multipliers that will in turn help in relation to local economies. It is for another day that I would also suggest to you that in different political groupings, I'm so pleased to have had questions from all of them, they will face an issue that is one that I will discuss in the future, which is in relation, how do you protect the real economy and its social connections and the citizens who depend on it from speculative flows? If you have the great cloud traveling around the world seeking to come to Earth, like toxic rain, creating bubbles, be it property bubbles or others, how do you protect your people? But I did say in the center part of my speech is that making economic decisions accountable is, of course, crucial. But that's something, by the way, that isn't only the property of the left. There are people all over the world who are very, very concerned about this, as to how we enable people to participate fully. And that has implications for education. But what it does mean about it is that we are not in medieval times, when there was a single paradigm that descended from God knows where and landed in all of our lives, so that we have somehow or another to move like Muppets between it. This is over. This, I'm glad to say about it, all over the world, people are leaving that kind of simplistic medievalism.
Thank you very much, President. We would have liked to continue to ask questions because my list is still long of people who wanted to put questions. but unfortunately I have to stop now, and I regret that we can't continue this discussion, but I hope that in another forum we will have the possibility to listen to you again. I would like to tell you that we are going to close now the vote about the judges, and this vote is going to be opened again at 15:30, and it will close at 5 o'clock this afternoon. The next session starts this afternoon at 15:30 with the agenda which is in your files. La séance est levée.